The morning broke over Port Charles with the kind of brittle clarity that exposes smudges on glass and flaws in alibis. In the austere light, Anna moved like a metronome set to a tempo only she could hear, methodical, relentless, measuring the heartbeat of a town that insisted it was fine while its pulse galloped with secrets. What began as a simple cross-check on Michael's whereabouts had metastasized into something thornier. A whisper network about a woman named Jacinda, a phone call that refused to die quietly, and the reappearance of a blade that should have remained sealed in evidence and memory. The city's river slid under its bridges the way truth slipped beneath denials, and Anna, who trusted currents more than claims, understood that clarity can be the cruelest light of all. Carly stood at the threshold of that light, chin lifted as if daring the sun to blink first. She had the confident stillness of someone who has survived storms by convincing them to go bash some other shoreline, yet even she knew Anna's questions weren't weather, they were geology. What did she actually know about Michael's alibi, down to the minute, down to the cell tower ping, down to the part where a mother's certainty slides into a mother's wishful thinking? Carly tried to give facts the spine they deserved. Where he said he was, who could have seen him, how the gaps between verifiable moments were normal, explainable, harmless. But there is a sound people make when truth starts to rearrange the furniture inside them, a small scrape of chair legs, and Anna heard it in the way Carly's voice softened around details that should have been crisp. It wasn't malice, it was the urge to pad sharp edges with velvet. Anna left with polite words and a colder certainty. When the story is warmed to body temperature, fingerprints vanish. Molly reached Anna with a file she hadn't meant to build but couldn't stop assembling, a collage of names and times held together by intuition and the faint smell of smoke clinging to paper. She didn't accuse, she annotated. The connection between Michael and Jacinda wasn't a headline so much as a recurring footnote, a coincidence repeating until it started to look like choreography. Molly's training told her that patterns are necessary but insufficient. Her gut told her that this one was dancing too close to the center of the page. Jacinda wasn't merely adjacent to Michael's movements, she was the quiet lane that kept appearing when the main road was supposedly blocked. If an alibi is a bridge, Molly said without saying, this one had load-bearing beams stamped with Jacinda's initials. Anna didn't smile, but a corner of her mind clicked into place. The problem was no longer whether Michael had an alibi, it was who had built it for him, and what price that architect would demand when the bill came due. While paper trails were being combed and timelines stitched, a different theater of truth opened behind a closed door, where the air tasted like old dust and recent adrenaline. Rick held the past in his hand, and the past was metal. The knife had a memory longer than any human grudge, and its presence turned the room into a museum of one unforgivable exhibit. He was both prosecutor and exhibit attendant, pointing, guiding, insisting that the audience, Alexis, see what she did not want to see. There is a particular cruelty in demanding that someone call for help while the threat of harm breathes against their throat. It makes the act of seeking rescue feel like complicity in one's own peril. Rick did not need to raise his voice. The blade elevated every syllable. He wanted sirens not to arrive, but to echo. He wanted Alexis to be the bell that summoned the storm. The phone trembled in her hand the way decisions tremble before they become consequences. Fate, however, tends to improvise. Ava appeared not like a hero but like a pressure change, the subtle drop before a tornado. Her entrance was the hinge on which the room swung from menace to calamity. There was no flourish, only precision, a hard interruption that folded Rick neatly into the dark. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, the silence afterward sounded like something broken under the floorboards. In the sudden quiet, the knife lost its voice and became merely a blade again, mute and accusing. Ava's breath came quick, not from exertion but from arithmetic. How many ways this could be told, how much of the telling would be believed, how far the shockwaves would travel if this room were ever mapped onto the city. She didn't say she had saved anyone, she calculated how to keep what had been saved worth the saving. It is one thing to stop a disaster and another to arrest its narrative. The latter is harder. Across town, Elizabeth pressed a phone to her ear and heard a story no one meant to narrate. There is a special intimacy in overhearing something you cannot unhear. It binds and banishes in the same breath. Voices, distant and sharpened by panic, braided together, Rick's edge, Alexis's tight, careful syllables, a thud that was unmistakable in any language. The line did not carry context, it carried impact. Elizabeth's body remembered triage before her mind caught up. She arranged what she knew into a structure sturdy enough to move with. Someone was hurt. Someone was scared. Somewhere a choice had been made and would need to be defended with every subsequent choice. The call ended like a candle snuffed by an invisible hand. People say that information is power. They forget how heavy power is when you must carry it alone across a crowded room. The city tilted to accommodate the weight. Anna traced the shockwaves as if they were isobars on a map, tracking pressure changes that made people speak too fast or not at all. Carly's poise frayed at the edges, not because she had lied, but because she had knitted her belief in Michael so tightly that any tug threatened to unravel the whole blanket. She wanted, fiercely and understandably, for love to be evidence. Molly wanted proof to be proof. They were not enemies, they were rival definitions of safety. The Jacinda vector sharpened as Anna followed the money, the rideshare receipts, the innocuous photographs where a shadow falls twice on the same sidewalk. In every one of Michael's uncontestable minutes, Jacinda appeared just off stage, a ghost light ensuring the scene never went dark. Anna's question was no longer whether Jacinda existed as a coincidence, but whose coincidence she had been hired to be. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Rick's body became a problem to be solved rather than a person to be reckoned with, and that transformation should have bothered everyone more than it did. Ava's pragmatism startled in its neatness. Stabilize, conceal, consult later. She treated the room like a crime scene in reverse, removing the event from the evidence. The knife, its silver memory intact, resumed its role as a relic with too long a provenance to be neutral. Alexis stared at it the way one stares at a bruise that proves the impact you wish had never happened. Survival comes with paperwork, statements, medical reports, those quiet questions you ask yourself when the lights are off and you are supposed to be sleeping. She had been forced into a corner and then yanked from it by a hand she did not call for. Gratitude and alarm make poor roommates. They argue while you try to make coffee. Elizabeth's dilemma expanded by the hour. What she had heard could not be fashioned into a clean report without tearing flesh from bone. To involve authorities would be to cast a net without checking who it might drown. To stay silent would be to let a dangerous current continue uncharted. She rehearsed her words in the mirror, and each draft sounded like a confession she hadn't intended to make. Her instinct was always toward healing, but healing requires first contact with pain, and the city had already decided its threshold was high. In a town where everyone is both patient and surgeon, triage becomes a political act. She turned the problem the way doctors turn a body in bed, to prevent unseen sores from forming. Every angle exposed a new risk. Anna moved the investigation forward not with a revelation but with an arrangement. She laid the pieces on her mental table: Carly's loyalty with its soft underbelly, Molly's skepticism with its hard shell, the recaptured knife, the interrupted assault, the overheard call, the woman named Jacinta who knew how to be essential without being visible. Nothing screamed, everything pointed. She asked for records no one knew they had kept. She revisited a security camera whose lens was smudged but not blind. She found the moment where a car that should have stayed parked drifted 6 minutes down the river of time and returned as if it had never left. Those 6 minutes were where a body could be moved, a story could be stitched, an alibi could be laundered until it passed for linen. 6 minutes is an eternity when you are rearranging fate. Carly learned that love becomes a liability when it refuses to learn the fact's last name. She wanted to protect Michael by insisting the world was wrong about him, but the world hadn't formed an opinion, it was busy counting. She feared that any doubt she expressed might leak into the air and be inhaled by someone unworthy of holding it. Anna, with a patience that belonged to winter rather than spring, returned to ask not for Carly's faith but for her timestamps. What Carly had offered earlier as the scaffolding of certainty now looked like festive bunting, pretty, sincere, weightless. She began to see that there is no betrayal in correcting the record when the record is a wish. The difference between shielding and smothering is measured in minutes, too. Molly, for her part, followed the Jacinta thread into a tangle of favors. There is a market in Port Charles for plausible timing, and Jacinta had cornered it. She knew which doors open without logging an entry, which lobbies reset their cameras at the very moments most people assume they're working, which coffee shops call out names loudly enough to stand in for witnesses. She wasn't a mastermind, she was a contractor. For a fee, she built alibis sturdy enough to pass inspection but flexible enough to be installed anywhere. If Michael had one of her bridges, Molly argued internally, then the question wasn't whether he had crossed it but why he believed he needed it at all. People do not commission architecture when there's a footpath at hand. What of Rick, the man who weaponized remembrance? When he woke, it was into a world rearranged around him. The room had been curated to minimize his story's oxygen. He understood, with the bitter clarity of the recently thwarted, that he had been transformed into a piece on someone else's board, valuable when moved, powerless when pinned. He tried to reconvert narrative into leverage. If he couldn't make the knife sing, he could make its silence suspicious. Yet even he sensed that the blade, historic, intimate, had finally become louder than he was. The objects we use to define our enemies end up defining us, and steel remembers the hands that gripped it. His path forward, he realized, depended on who would carry his version into rooms where he was not welcome. That, ironically, might be Elizabeth, if she chose to speak, if she chose him as her subject, if people stake their futures on smaller ifs. The day folded into evening, and the city performed its ritual of lights blinking on like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Anna stood over her map one last time and noticed how often the same names were forced together by necessity rather than friendship. Carly next to Molly, Alexis adjacent to Ava, Michael's line crossing Jacinda's arc, Elizabeth hovering like a satellite that records without choosing a side. She marked the interval of the 6 missing minutes with a pen that doesn't smudge and wrote a note that was not an order but an instruction to herself. Find the motive beneath the mechanism. Anyone can purchase a method, only motives leave scent on the air. She closed the notebook on the day with the grim softness of someone tucking in a child who refuses to sleep. Night did not clarify, it condensed. In living rooms and hospital corridors, in kitchens where coffee surrendered to whiskey, people rehearsed answers to questions that had not yet been asked. Carly discovered the tenderness and terror of telling herself the whole truth in the privacy of her own skull. If Michael had accepted an alibi he did not need, then something else was hunting him, guilt or danger, loyalty or blackmail, and a mother's job was not to erase the hunter but to understand its appetite. Molly balanced her file on her knees and acknowledged that suspicion is not proof, but sometimes it is the lantern you carry until you find the fuse box. Alexis sat with the knife's memory like a bruise she couldn't keep herself from pressing, wincing as she tested the future's threshold for pain. Ava stared at a blank wall and saw, vividly, every story that wall might hear if she misjudged the speed of incoming sirens. Elizabeth lay awake and counted, not sheep, but possible mornings, one where she speaks, one where she doesn't, one where someone else tells the story and gets it wrong. By dawn, the city had decided to pretend nothing had happened. People do this when something has absolutely happened. It is a way to stretch the time before consequences arrive. Anna did not allow the luxury. She sent the subpoena that would pull Jacinda's tidy bridges into daylight. She scheduled again with Carly, a conversation without accusation, a request for the kind of help that hurts because it is real. She asked Molly to trace a payment that existed only as a rumor of zeros crossing from one bank to another. She notified a colleague, quietly, that a knife with too much history had re-entered circulation, and that it never, ever did so without cost. The investigation no longer felt like discovery, it felt like gravity. Everyone already knew, at some molecular level, which way this would fall. And yet, in Port Charles, inevitability always has a rival: the human talent for last-second renovation. Perhaps Michael's motive will turn out to be protection rather than evasion. Perhaps Jacinda's bridges will reveal not culpability but the outline of a trap he was trying to lure someone else across. Perhaps Rick's menace will be reclassified as a symptom of a deeper conspiracy that needed him volatile and loud. Perhaps the phone call Elizabeth overheard will serve as a metronome for telling the story in time rather than a hammer for smashing reputations. These are the possibilities people feed themselves to keep standing. Anna acknowledges them without letting them set her compass. She follows the proof, which is slower than hope but more reliable in a storm. By the time the river reflected noon, the board was set again as if for the first time. Carly squared her shoulders and offered what she had scrubbed of wishful edges. Molly, steadier than she felt, surrendered her file to process and let herself be merely a citizen for the span of a single breath. Alexis placed the knife into the exact right envelope and gave it to hands whose only loyalty is to chain of custody. Ava didn't apologize, she calibrated. Rick learned the cost of becoming a story rather than the author of one. Elizabeth chose, and whether she chose to speak or to save, the choice transformed her from observer to participant. Above them all, Anna watched the minute hand tick and remembered the 6 minutes that had gone missing. She would find them, not because the town demanded it, but because time itself had filed a complaint. In the end, the drama was not a bloodbath, nor a courtroom flourish, nor a headline written in thunder. It was a city discovering that its quiet is a costume, that love cannot be notarized into evidence, that survival is not the same as safety, and that every object, knife, phone, ledger, photograph, waits patiently to be asked what it remembers. The questions have been asked now. The answers, already moving toward the surface, will not arrive politely. They will break the skin of the river and demand to be named.